A racist remark on live TV shattered his life, but that humiliation sparked a fight for real justice. It was 1979 in Augusta, Georgia. Not the Deep South's harshest corner, but still southern enough for its shadows to linger. The kind of town where shiny bank windows sparkled in the sun. But behind those glass walls, the old white order ruled quietly and firmly. Black folks served the coffee, brought the plates, cleaned the windows, but rarely, if ever, sat in the offices, even when those offices had more windows than the local schools. Ellis Whitmore was 29 and worked as an assistant archivist at City Hall. His job wasn't on any door plaque. It only existed in dusty reports and memos. No official ever called him by name. He was the basement boy, the folder guy, or simply the archivist. Every day, Ellis trudged down the creaking wooden stairs to the City Hall's basement, where old files and forgotten projects were stacked like forgotten ghosts. Deeds, wills, building permits, city council notes, alphabetized but abandoned. His hands were like a musician's, slender, precise. But Ellis had never touched a piano. His fingers were meant for something else, to carefully handle brittle papers so that the past wouldn't crumble into dust. Over 2 years, he digitized nearly 3,000 documents, sifted through 40 drawers stuffed with city records, and meticulously arranged every contractor, purchase order from 1945 to 1975. Not a single thank you, no transfer to a sunny office, just a new desk lamp to ease the yellow paper strain on his eyes. Ellis lived in a tiny one-room apartment above a barber shop owned by a former Army sergeant, a quiet black man who spoke as little as a stone. Each evening, Ellis would take off his shoes, shrug off his jacket, and sit on a rickety stool with a broken leg. He ate cold canned beans while staring out the window at the parking lot below. He never complained. He knew the weight of words, and he knew they meant nothing here unless you were born with the right skin and the right name. One early March morning, Ellis arrived at work earlier than usual. The basement was cold. He flicked on his desk lamp, put a kettle on the coil burner, and spread out the 1963 Molten District files. Then he heard a door slam upstairs, a loud, sharp sound that cracked through the silence like a shot. Then a woman's voice, clipped and impatient, with the polished diction of a college graduate from a well-to-do family. It was Caitlin Strong, morning anchor for local station WRGA, there to interview the mayor. The live broadcast was set for 9 a.m. Ellis was supposed to carry a box of documents on city equality initiatives, a mere formality, but necessary. The mayor wanted to show the cameras that Augusta was working toward integration. He didn't believe it himself, but it looked good on TV. Ellis grabbed the box and climbed out of the basement. He tiptoed through the hall, careful not to bump his foot against the walls. He understood the need to be invisible. The lobby was already buzzing. Cameras, bright lights, microphones. Caitlin stood there, tall heels clicking, white coat sharp as a blade, her face like it belonged on a magazine cover, a smile as cold as glass. When Ellis stepped in, she didn't even glance his way. He set the box against the wall and stepped back. Then she turned abruptly, as if someone had stepped on her toes. "What's this?" she snapped, eyes not on his face but on the name badge pinned to his chest. Ellis opened his mouth to explain, but she already nodded at her assistant. "Get this man out of here. We don't need any randoms on camera. This is a live broadcast, not a market." His blood boiled, but he stayed silent, just nodded and stepped back. Then the cameraman leaned in and whispered to her that Ellis was the archivist, the one who found the mayor's project box, that he actually worked here. Caitlin laughed, on camera. It was the kind of light, casual humor that livened up the broadcast. "Oh, sorry," she said loudly, turning to him. "You just popped up so unexpectedly. I thought you might be a delivery guy." No real apology followed. It was an excuse silhouetted like a commercial brake line. Her face didn't change. Her eyes stayed hard and glassy. The interview began. The mayor droned on with rehearsed platitudes. The cameras caught every smooth response. Caitlin nodded, smiled, led the show. Ellis stood in the hallway, listening to every word. Something inside him cracked, not because of the humiliation. He was used to that, but because of how easily it happened. Like it wasn't even an act, just a breeze passing through. He was not a man in that moment. He was a shadow, a glitch in the frame. The next morning, the local paper ran a story about the mayor's progressive initiatives. The front photo showed Caitlin smiling with microphone in hand. In the corner, barely noticeable, was Ellis holding a box lost in shadow, like a piece of furniture. No caption. That picture said everything. Place, time, and the rules of the game. The cold, steady power of those who decide who appears on camera and who stays in the dark. Ellis went back to the basement, pulled out the next folder. His hands trembled, but he didn't stop working. He knew when truth lived in paper, someone had to make sure it didn't collect dust for nothing. What he didn't know was that someone had been watching that morning's live broadcast, a man with power and memory. And to him, Ellis wasn't just furniture. Up on the hill just outside downtown Augusta stood a brick villa with weathered shutters and quiet rooms. At the very moment Caitlin Strong was laughing on live TV at the box-carrying boy, a little television sat on the kitchen counter, softly crackling with static. It had been on since early morning, not because anyone was glued to the morning shows, but out of habit. The sound of voices in an empty house was a reminder that someone had once lived there. The house belonged to Charles Griffin, 73 years old and nearly forgotten in the local history books. Back in his day, he'd been a respected federal prosecutor. In the 60s, he was one of the few white lawyers standing with the civil rights fighters. His name made headlines when cases were brought against Klansmen and segregationist governors. But after he retired in 1974, Charles vanished from public life. Folks said he'd moved to Vermont. The truth was he stayed put, not out of love for Georgia, but because he couldn't leave until things were put right. Only nobody really knew what right meant. The WRGA morning broadcast played quietly in the background, like everything else in the house. Charles barely listened until he heard the mayor's name, a man he'd tangled with once upon a time. His eyes flicked to the screen, where the mayor talked about equal opportunity and an open city government for all. That made Charles's skin crawl. He knew it was a lie. He knew this mayor from when he'd worked as a lawyer for construction companies that hired black workers off the books and tossed them out without a dime. The mayor hadn't changed. He just put on a tie and learned how to say social justice with the same dead expression he once used saying labor laws. But Charles's gaze didn't linger on the mayor, nor on Caitlin, though he recognized her last name. Her father was the judge who dismissed a case involving the beating of 3 black teenagers down in Wilkes County. He remembered Caitlin's face, well-groomed, polished, practiced for the camera. She could smile even while saying something truly cruel. What caught Charles's eye was something else. A young black man standing in the shadows with a box in his hands. The expression on his face was guarded, the look of someone swallowing the same bitter pill for the 1,000th time, determined not to let it settle into resignation. He saw Caitlin point at the man like he was nothing but extra furniture. He saw her laugh, saw the cameraman highlight it. And in that moment, Charles understood everything. That man on camera was Ellis Whitmore, not by name but by his look, the kind of quiet strength Charles recognized instantly. The same strength he'd seen in those he fought for back in the 60s. Only back then, they got hit with nightsticks. Now they got mocked on live television. But the goal was the same, to diminish, to erase. Charles stood up from his chair. His movement was slow, like a man who hadn't been stirred for far too long. He walked to his office, where boxes of old cases, letters, and journals sat. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old notebook filled with names. Many names. Charles never forgot. He didn't believe in revenge, but he believed in memory. That same day, he called an old contact, the editor of an independent black newspaper in Atlanta, one of the few still holding on despite an advertising boycott. He called not as a prosecutor, but as a man who still knew when something important had happened. "You got about 3 minutes?" Charles asked, not giving his name. "Who's this?" The voice on the other end tensed. "The guy who once made Randall Farrow apologize to Malcolm Sam's mother." There was a pause, then, "I'm listening." Charles laid it all out, the details without anger, but with precision. He had a way of telling facts so the importance rang clear. This was no accident. This was a marker of the system, like the sunset that doesn't happen all at once, but creeps in slowly until you realize night has fallen. The editor promised to dig through archives and find out who Ellis Whitmore really was. At first, he wanted to call Ellis directly, but Charles stopped him. "Don't do that. He doesn't know yet what happened to him. Don't be the first to tell him he was on camera like an accusation. He needs to feel it himself. Then we'll step in." That evening at the WRGO newsroom, Caitlin Strong found a letter. No stamp, just slipped into the drop box by the door. The paper was thick and white, the handwriting neat, like a typewriter font. Inside was just one sentence. "You live in a glass house and throw stones. Are you sure your glass will survive the broadcast?" She didn't get what it meant, shrugged and tossed the letter away. She'd seen worse. A woman on air had to have thick skin. That's what they told her in college. Yet the strange feeling lingered all day, like something was off, like someone had seen something they weren't supposed to see. Meanwhile, Ellis did what he always did, descended to the basement. He didn't know his face had been on the air, didn't know someone had noticed. He was just doing his job. He set down a new box, turned on his lamp. A new folder landed on his desk. The City Integration Program, 1965 to 1972. Dusty, heavy, almost forgotten. But inside were documents that someone had already tried to hide once before. And this time, Ellis was ready to read them all the way through. He didn't know yet that outside the basement, the world was starting to move, that he was no longer alone. When the silence settled in the basement of the municipal archives, it wasn't the kind of silence you find in a library. It was thick, heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Ellis felt that in this place, more than anywhere else in the city, he existed not for somebody, but simply was. No one expected him to talk or smile here. He didn't have to swallow biting remarks like he did down at the city diner, where the waitress would toss menus on the table without even looking. No women clutching their purses as they passed by. Not even the lamp seemed to judge him. He worked at a desk he'd fixed himself, one of those sturdy old things left over from the 60s. Burned into the corner of the wooden top were the initials, R.J.W. Maybe a former clerk. Maybe just someone who once sat here, hoping the papers might hold something to chip away at the rusty system. The folder he bent over was labeled Urban Renewal Program, 1965 to 1972, stamped not for distribution. Odd, usually these kinds of documents got sent straight to the Central Archive in Atlanta. So why was this one buried here, in this forgotten corner among water bills and taxi licenses? He flipped through the yellowed pages slowly. Contracts, names, lists of compensation paid to residents whose homes were bulldozed for development. The handwriting was small, typed, mostly names of African-American families. But where other files listed dollar amounts, here there were dashes, or the sums read $0, 0 cents. Voluntary waiver of compensation. Ellis frowned. Too many waivers. Too neatly organized. He kept going. Got to some internal correspondence. Letters between architects, officials, and developers. Some pages marked for official use only. And then a single sheet clipped to the others with a paper clip. It nearly slipped out when Ellis turned the page. This one was a different size. A typewritten page with thick, hand-drawn underlines. At the top was a date, July 1966. Below, a name, Robert T. Strong, Caitlin's father. Then the sentence that made Ellis's blood run cold. If we compensate black families at the same rates as white families, it will create an unwanted stir. The program must remain technical, not political. In case of questions, I recommend using the term voluntary relocation agreement. Ellis stared long at that paragraph. The words felt like a punch to the chest. Not because they were shocking, he'd known all along how things really worked, but because here, black on white, was the cold formula of cynical segregation in action, practiced so well it was automatic. And next to it, the signature of the very man whose name now graced the halls of the city hall. The same man Caitlin's daughter had called the builder of the new Georgia on the news. He didn't get up right away. He sat, hands clenched, as if afraid the document might vanish if he looked away. Then carefully tore the page from the folder, slipped it into his pocket, and put the rest back in the box. He knew if he took it upstairs, handed it to anyone, it would disappear. Always did. In towns like Augusta, paper melted faster than metal. Outside, the sun hit his face. Bright, not hot, but blinding. Around the corner of the archives stood Jimmy Baines, a courier, a white guy about 40, a former alcoholic often assigned to watch over Ellis so he wouldn't nod off on the job. Jimmy choked on a cigarette when he saw him. "Found gold, boss," he smirked, watching Ellis straighten his coat collar. "Something like that," Ellis said without opening his mouth much. He got into his old Ford Taurus in the parking lot. The engine sputtered before roaring to life. In the glove box was a business card left by a woman who talked a lot about municipal cooperation. He remembered, during 10 minutes of talk, she'd said, "Help the community 5 times without once clarifying which community." He tossed the card out the window. The paper drifted toward a trash bin and caught on a bush. He didn't head home. Instead, he drove through streets he'd known since childhood, past the neighborhood where there used to be a theater for colored folks, torn down to make way for a housing complex no one ever moved into. Past the school where his mother had once taught history, before the state cut funding and replaced the African American Studies program with regional sociology. He stopped in front of Aunt Linda's house, the same aunt who always said, "Truth isn't on the screen, Ellis. Truth is what they want to erase from it." He didn't call, just sat in the car, pulled out the page again, read it once more. He knew now. This wasn't just paper. This was proof, a weapon, a ticket. But to where? Meanwhile, trouble was brewing back at the WRGA newsroom. Despite their small part in this story, social media started buzzing with clips from the morning broadcasts. Someone had clipped Caitlin's segment, slowed it down, added captions. "Watch how a Southern white woman smiles when she sees a black man with a box." The mayor, the very same who preached equality on screen, called the producers, demanding they take down the video from the website. Caitlin slammed the dressing room door, blaming the editors. Threatening letters arrived. Flowers showed up too. She didn't understand what was happening. "I didn't say anything wrong. It was just a bad joke." But the moment had already set off a chain reaction. The stone had dropped in the water, ripples spreading. Ellis sat in his car, staring at the paper. And in that moment, he realized. His face stuck in people's minds not because of the box he carried, but because he didn't look away. Because the camera didn't see a worker. It saw a witness. Ellis got home late. It had been dark for hours, and like usual, the streetlights in his neighborhood flickered on every other pole. He parked his Taurus at the corner of Piney and 3rd, right by the apartment building whose facade was stained by time, mold, and plain old neglect. From a second-floor window came the faint sound of a TV. Someone was watching the news. He slowed his pace. Caitlin's voice was rough, like she had a cold. He recognized her tone from the very first word. Not because he actually followed her broadcasts. No, Ellis wasn't the type to buy into the news, especially when black folks were only mentioned in stories about crime or poverty stats. No, he recognized her by how she stressed certain words, like she was saying African-American last names the way someone might say the names of fancy foreign dishes they'd never actually tasted. Once inside his apartment, he made himself some tea, cheap, bagged, dusty tasting, and sat down at the kitchen table where that same document lay. The paper was crumpled now, a breadcrumb pressed into one corner, but the words hadn't faded. He read it again and again, like he was trying to memorize it, swallow it whole, make it part of himself. He knew that paper could land a blow, but he still didn't know exactly where to hit. Then he remembered, back in college when he once gave lectures to freshmen about urban geography and racial economics, there was a regular attendee, not a student, but an older white man who came every week and always sat in the back row. He never asked questions, but one day after class, when everyone else had left, the man came up to him and said, "If you ever have something to show the world, show it to me." He handed Ellis a business card. Ellis had laughed then, thinking the guy was nuts. He didn't remember the name, but he didn't throw the card away either. He slipped it between the pages of an old book, Invisible Man by Ellison. Ellis got up and went to the bookshelf. Books were stacked too deep, some still in boxes. He rummaged through them for nearly an hour before finally finding that worn softcover with the faded title. And inside, on page 13, just like back then, lay the business card. The name, Garrett Dillon, producer, PBS, regional affiliate, not WRGA, not the mainstream, but someone with a story. The guy who once made that film about the redlining in Atlanta. A film never aired in prime time, but quoted in university classes like a textbook. He didn't sleep all night, writing, erasing, starting over. Eventually, he sent one simple sentence. "I have a document explaining why they took our neighborhood, our streets, our homes, and our dignity." Attached a photo. Signed it, Ellis Whitmore. 2 days later, the reply came. No greeting, no formalities. "Come, bring the original. You know the address." He did. Garrett met him in an old building that had once been a bakery, then a radio station, now a post-production studio. It smelled of coffee and raw footage, photos of abandoned houses, people, bridges that no longer existed hung on the walls. Dillon was tall, gray-haired, with a face carved by stories left untold, not by age. He didn't ask, "Are you sure?" He just read, closed his eyes, and said, "You have no idea who's going to see this." Later that day, a copy of the document sat on the mayor's desk. The man stared at it without blinking. The paper trembled in his hands. He knew that the name Strong was more than just a name. It was streets, schools, a scholarship fund named for Robert T. Strong, the same name that earned trust from donors and symbolized the Southern legacy, the same name carried by the morning news anchor. Meanwhile, WRGA was flooded with letters, hundreds of them, some asking why the interview with the black archivist disappeared from the schedule, others demanding explanations, some threatening boycotts. At first, the producers kept quiet, then they apologized. Vague, nameless statements. "A misjudgment in story presentation." Caitlin went on air, not from the studio, but against the city skyline, trying to talk about misunderstandings, a bad joke, a desire to focus on the future. But behind her, someone held up a sign. "Ask the father about compensation." The camera didn't cut away fast enough. Ellis sat in silence. He wasn't after revenge, didn't want anyone fired. What he wanted was for someone, anyone, it was say it out loud. "Yes, we ripped you off." Not by accident, not because it just happened that way, but because we could. But nobody said it. And so, in that dusty, burnt-smelling PBS editing room, the work began. Garrett pieced together footage, stories, recordings of the old-timers who got kicked off Linden Street, shots of the wrecked houses now draped with banners, new condos from $500,000, photos, documents, the blueprint of segregation. And at the center, Ellis, without a voice raised, without a shout, without slogans, just a man who found a paper he wasn't supposed to see. A man once used as a prop in a studio, now proof. He didn't know the film would be shown in Washington, that he'd be called to the restitution committee, that Caitlin would quit the station for family reasons. He didn't know what was coming next. He just opened his desk drawer and put the document back inside. Let it lie there, in case anyone ever said again, nothing like this ever happened. The morning after Garrett Dillon's documentary premiered in the small municipal cultural center, Ellis woke up to the hum of early alarms and the shouts of street vendors. The noise of the narrow streets, where buildings pressed close together and faded signs for cafes and auto shops hung limp from years of sun and neglect, filled his head. But no matter how much the city's sound washed over him, Ellis couldn't shake the feeling that today was different. There was tension in the air, like the city itself had passed through some invisible tipping point. The screening room was packed with a mixed crowd, from old-timers with white hair and faces mapped like the neighborhood streets, to teenagers hearing about these events for the first time, events Ellis knew firsthand. There was no place here for political correctness, only raw truth falling on everyone like dust from the cracked ceiling. The film opened with shots of abandoned blocks and empty factories, monuments to shattered lives and communities that once echoed with laughter and music, where families had roots stretching deep into history. The camera cut to archival photos, official reports, and letters where powerful white city officials discussed plans to evict people and strip away rights. These were interwoven with scenes of the present-day streets where luxury condos had sprouted on the ruins of old homes. Texts, quotes, voices of former residents layered pain, survival, and resistance into a living tapestry. Ellis sat in the front row, watching as the crowd's mood shifted from outrage to quiet despair. He understood that these were people who'd grown up in the city, who knew its streets and families, who often lived side by side with white neighbors, and yet for years had no power to speak the truth aloud. The film ripped open a wound, and now it bled in plain sight. A woman stood up, white, elderly, dressed in a sharp suit. When the screening ended, she asked to speak in a measured voice. It was Linda Hartman, a city council member responsible for allocating funds for neighborhood development and historic preservation. She spoke about the need to consider all perspectives, the complexities of integration, and how the past can't be changed, but the future can be built while avoiding mistakes. But every phrase sounded like an excuse, cold and hollow. Some in the audience winced, but Linda pressed on, reciting what felt like a rehearsed speech where words like justice and harmony were little more than empty echoes. Outside the center, Ellis noticed the city wasn't waiting. His phone buzzed with messages from old friends talking about meetings, rallies, even protests. The streets were filling with signs demanding rights be restored and historic wrongs acknowledged. Local papers and radio stations, normally silent on racial injustice, began publishing stories based on Garrett's document. Students and teenagers organized discussions in libraries and university halls. But resistance pushed back. Caitlin, the very anchor who'd once done that ill-fated interview, was now a spokesperson for one of Linda's support groups. Her carefully crafted, neutral-sounding statements gave off a chill, like she was trying to keep a lid on the situation. She spoke about the need for understanding between communities and urged people not to fall for provocation. That kind of hypocrisy sent shivers down Ellis's spine, especially since he now lived in a divided world where every gesture and word was weighed and reinterpreted. His quiet work as an archivist had become something much more dangerous. He was now the keeper of a truth many wanted to forget or silence. One day, Michael showed up at his door, a former history teacher and black activist who'd long been trying to break the wall of silence in City Hall. He brought stacks of papers, photos, and video recordings gathered during his own investigation. What followed was a long, almost wordless conversation. No time for petty explanations, just determination. Michael handed Ellis a list of names, those who'd played direct roles in discriminatory decisions and those still holding high positions in city government. Meanwhile, life in the city buzzed on. Shopkeepers talked more openly about the events. Bus riders exchanged conversations that once would have been taboo in public. But there were others too. Folks who acted like nothing had changed, shutting their eyes and ears tight against the problem. Ellis overheard one afternoon in a veterans club district, old men with deep wrinkles and tired eyes cursing, those left-wing activists in blacks wanting everything handed to them. Their words felt ritualistic, dangerous because they poisoned the city's air with anxiety. Evening came. The municipal building hosted hearings on recognizing historic injustice and creating a compensation fund for affected families. Ellis knew a lot was on the line. He'd prepared a dry, document-backed report with photos and testimony. His voice couldn't falter. Outside the hearing room, Ellis ran into Linda Hartman. She looked worn out, but her eyes gleamed with familiar steel. "You're right, Mr. Whitmore. We all have to move forward. But remember, the future is built not on blame, but on dialogue." Ellis said nothing. He simply nodded and stepped into the room where hundreds of eyes, skeptical, angry, weary, hungry for justice, waited. The hearings lasted hours. Speeches, heated debates, attempts to drown out opposing voices. Ellis listened. Then he spoke, calm but powerful. He didn't plead or demand. He told a story everyone needed to hear to understand the unerasable stain of injustice behind the city's polished surface. When it was over, the crowd filtered out. Some clapped, some stayed silent. Ellis felt the weight settle on his shoulders. Not just history, but responsibility. At that moment, he realized this was only the beginning. The wind swept dust off the streets, reminding him that cities, like people, can't forget fast, and they shouldn't. On that first chilly day of late fall, when the city was wrapped in a damp, gray fog, Ellis Whitmore stood again outside the city hall as people gathered inside. The very air buzzed with tension and expectation. Today, in this building at the heart of the administrative district, the first real reckoning of a fight born from cruel public humiliation, and now burning bright with community outrage and demands for justice, was about to take place. The city Ellis had known since childhood, its mosaic of faces, the noisy alleys and back streets where whispered stories of generations lived, could no longer stay the same. Over the past months, the faces of his neighbors had changed. They wore exhaustion, yes, but also something like awakening, as if they'd glimpsed a truth that had long been locked away. The faded walls of their homes, painted in dull colors for years, now seemed like bold witnesses to the new chapter the city was rewriting. Inside the hall, a heavy silence hung, broken only by the rustle of papers, footsteps, and muffled sighs. The crowd was diverse: Black, Latino, white, some no longer able to turn a blind eye to injustice, others struggling to accept a reality they never wanted to face. Among them was Ellis, wearing a plain dark suit that felt too modest for the gravity of the place and the weight of expectations. Just months ago, it would have seemed impossible that a hearing like this, about historical discrimination with real demands for reparations, would become part of everyday life. Ellis remembered how before that first interview that sparked the scandal and dragged him into the heart of the conflict, his life had been quiet, secluded, almost invisible. He was just an archivist at the city library, dedicated to gathering documents nobody else wanted to touch. Now he was the face of a movement, not by choice, but by necessity. His speech that day wasn't just a list of facts and accusations. It was a hymn of pride, bitterness, and hope. He spoke not about himself, but about those whose voices had been drowned out, whose lives were torn apart, whose homes were bulldozed without warning. He spoke of the generations who built the city and whom the city rejected. His voice echoed a long-forgotten truth, stirring up the dust of time and forcing the listeners to confront the legacy their own ancestors left behind, a pain hard to admit. Linda Hartman, who had recently offered only dry, detached statements, looked different now, more vulnerable, more understanding. After everyone had spoken and the floor opened for discussion, she made a surprising move. She backed the creation of a special fund for reparations and programs aimed at restoring historical justice. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a breakthrough. A door finally cracked open. The city streets rippled with reaction. News channels ran interviews with activists, veterans, parents, and children who had suffered under decades of city policies. Ellis met with them, heard their stories, shared their pain and their hope. He understood this was about more than money or buildings. It was about restoring dignity and the right to be heard. That evening, the city glowed with a different kind of light. People stepped out of their homes, gathering in squares and streets, raising hands, hugging, some quietly weeping. This was the light of change, slow, difficult, but relentless. Ellis walked through neighborhoods now feeling less like a stranger, more like they belonged to him and everyone fighting for justice. He stopped in front of his childhood home, now partially restored, with new windows and doors, but still holding on to its old soul. This was where kids from his block once played, where voices and laughter had filled the air, voices they now wanted to bring back. He ran his hand over the rough brick, feeling history woven into every crack and scratch, memories that wouldn't fade even when some tried to silence them. Inside him churned a mix of bitterness and pride, pain and strength. Ellis knew this was just the beginning. There would be more battles and trials ahead, but he also knew they'd already won, because for the first time in years, that truth was out in the open, impossible to hide in the shadows. The horizon was heavy with clouds, but at the very edge, a light was breaking through, faint and fragile, like the hope Ellis and his allies carried in their hearts. And as the first stars flickered in the night sky, he looked up and understood. His city, its people, and all their history. It wasn't just pages from the past. It was a living, breathing organism, able to grow, change, and heal. His fight had become part of a larger movement, a force unstoppable by words or hate. The road ahead would be hard. Fear and hatred would still lurk. But now they had a weapon stronger than insults or silence. It was the truth, a truth worth fighting for, no matter what. Ellis stood on the street, the city's hum fading into the cool night air, and he felt a fire burning in his chest, one that would never go out, the fire lighting the way for all still searching for justice's light.